Hello, environmental science class. This is the content video for Unit 2, Section 5. We are going to be talking about the three largest or most groundbreaking environmental protection laws that the United States has passed on the federal level. So we're specifically going to be talking about the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. Don't worry about memorizing the years that I mentioned today. These are mainly for clarification when there are multiple different laws of the same name. I'm terrible with dates. I don't expect you to be great with them, but just generally, I want you to be able to keep them in mind when we're talking about these, at least for decades, and like beginning of the decade or the end of the decade. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Clean Air Act and some things that led up to it, so the background information, right? So in Donora, Pennsylvania, which is on the kind of like if you're looking at the middle of Pennsylvania, it's to the west. So in 1948, there was something called an atmospheric inversion, where a lot of high pressure was above an area of low pressure, and a bunch of pollution in the air got trapped. Almost 7,000 people died from this over the course of a week. And in the late 1940s, this made big news nationally. So this was widespread. News of this was widespread across all of the U.S., across newspapers and radio news. Television wasn't quite 100% there. In the 1950s, states responded to this by passing a lot of their own laws. And because of that, the federal government didn't have to do quite as much as we'll see with some of the other stuff we'll talk about today. But in 1963, Congress passed the Clean Air Act, which was one of the first big federal laws of its kind. It gave $95 million for air purification at a local, state, and federal level. So that money could be used across every level of government, not just for federal purposes. It also authorized official research into techniques for monitoring and controlling air pollution. At the beginning, this was mainly for industrial pollution and off-gassing and smoke. But it later went into all kinds of different air pollution, including sound pollution. We'll talk more about this in the unit we have on the atmosphere. Just 7 years later, this was expanded upon in the Clean Air Act of 1970, and it established federal standards and increased the EPA, that's the Environmental Patrol Agency, authority to enforce them. So the Environmental Protection Agency is now able to enforce these standards, and usually this means levying heavy fines or shutting down factories, not necessarily taking a single person to jail. It also authorized the EPA to control motor vehicle emissions. So cars weren't able to dump as much smoke and exhaust out the rears. This led to things like catalytic converters and an increase in quality of mufflers, which do more than just make it quiet. All right. The Clean Water Act, this one goes back a little farther, and so the history of it is a little bit bigger. Again, you don't have to memorize every single date. I do want you to get the general idea behind them, though. All right, so at the very end of the 1800s, the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899 was passed by Congress, and it mainly allowed the Army Corps of Engineers to work in the rivers and harbors of the United States and to make sure that they aren't filled. It gave them the ability to dredge, which means to pull up from below. So to take all that extra silt mainly. That's sand and soil and minerals and rocks that have been pressed down the river to the bay or the harbor or the delta and take it out, remove it, so that that harbor can continue to serve, especially for deeper ships. So the Army Corps of Engineers is enabled to make sure that especially the intercontinental and international harbors are protected and can stay safe. The Oil Pollution Act of 1924 makes it so that factories can't purposefully or intentionally discharge fuel oil into tidal waters. So tidal waters, that means these are oceans, right? Rivers and streams that feed into the ocean are also protected here. But this is mainly looking about on the coast. So you're not allowed to dump extra oil or contaminated oil into tidal waters, 1924. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act is really the biggest precursor of the Clean Water Act, and it created a set of water quality programs. So these are federal level programs to make water clean and say this is the level at which we're going to say water is clean versus not clean. They do this by monitoring the amount of particulates in a part per million. So this is kind of like a percentage, but smaller, right? Because percentage is per 100. So this is per million. And they looked at testing different pollutants. I don't need you to memorize the individual pollutants here, so I'm not going to cover them. It also allowed money to be set aside for state and local governments to do this testing. And it was only for interstate waters, so water that flowed between states. So if the river is just inside one state, or a lake is in one state, or a pond, it's not covered, right? This is for the bigger rivers, especially the ones like the Mississippi and Colorado. The Water Quality Act of 1965 said that states are responsible for setting water quality standards for these interstate waters. This includes all those rivers, streams, and lakes that touch multiple states. So it shifted the responsibility from the federal government of maintaining those water quality programs to the states, right? It also created the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration, which oversaw the state setting of water quality standards. And if they failed to set their own water quality standards, the federal government would step in and do that through this administration. A lot of times this meant that if the state didn't set their own standards, the federal government would come in and set stricter standards, so tougher laws were in place there. In 1969, up near Chicago, well, in Chicago, a river caught fire. This is a picture from the Smithsonian. It was published in a couple of newspapers, actually a lot of newspapers nationally, where oil that had accidentally spilled into the river as well as purposely polluted into the river burned. This was not the first of its kind. The Cuyahoga River had caught fire at least 12 times before this time. It destroyed 3 tugboats. This picture shows one of those tugboats being destroyed and caught in the fire. 3 buildings along the coast and large stretch of the harbor itself in Chicago was destroyed. This made national news, and it spurred the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972. So remember, amendments are how we change active constitutional law. So that last law we talked about, right? The Water Quality Act of 1965 gets amended. And so this is the big, here's what we're talking about for the Clean Water Act, right? So it said that it started a lot of programs to research and control water pollution. It set up assistance for municipalities, so local governments, in building and expanding sewage treatment plants so that, what you flush down the toilet doesn't just immediately go into drinking water. And it also prohibits discharge to U.S. waterways without permit. So if you are dumping anything into a U.S. waterway, you need to have permission to do that. This isn't just individuals that are like driving their truck to the river, but factories that have waste products need to be able to control it and say where it's going, and it can't touch U.S. waters without a permit to do so. That doesn't mean they're not allowed. It just means they have to get paperwork and approval to do it. It also set technology-based standards for municipal and industrial sources. So when I mean technology-based standards, I mean that it actually requires someone to go to the waterway and test it. A lot of times this is done at a dam or some kind of actual building along the waterway. It's not someone going to the actual place every day or every year. Sometimes it is. So again, we are looking at a measurement of a pollutant on a parts per million scale. If it's above that, that means there's too much pollution of that pollutant being a single thing that's being dumped in. There's too much of that, so it's not clean. If it's below that threshold of parts per million, that means it's okay. There is much less than required, or there's just barely less than required. So this is a lower is better measurement, because lower means cleaner. It also established specific water quality standards in that it gave oversight of risk-based requirements, which set site-specific allowable pollutant levels. So these are what those issued technology-based standards, these are what they refer to, the water quality standards. It also said that we're going to start issuing national water quality inventory reports. So on a national level, there are reports of individual waterways, so rivers, streams, lakes, harbors, bays, oceans, deltas, all that stuff. We're going to say, here's the water quality in that specific location. So it's looking at all these pollutants. It's also looking at oxygenation and nitrate levels. Again, we'll talk about some more of these specific things later in later units. We're just kind of setting them up for now. Right, so we've already talked about water pollution and land pollution and air pollution and the legislation that covered that. While we're here, I also want to talk about the Endangered Species Act because it's very similar. But instead of talking about a specific resource, we're talking about species, so living things, animals, plants, insects, mushrooms, fungi, everything here. However, it wasn't that way when we started. All right, so pre-1900, there was a visible decline in species population. So people noticed there weren't as many animals of a specific type, right, a species, around. Specifically, bison, passenger pigeons, and whooping cranes. So bison used to be innumerable. There were so many of them on the plains of the Midwest and the Near West, which are kind of like the Rockies. It's an old way of talking about it. And then they were down to a few smaller herds. Passenger pigeons were the same way. They used to fill the skies in areas, but they'd been overhunted and almost extinct at this point in time. Whooping cranes, same thing. There used to be a lot of them in specific locations, and people noticed they weren't there anymore. So it led to a few different things. I'm going to cover, just like I did with the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, we're going to cover a few of the pieces of legislation, laws, that led up to them, and then we're going to cover the Endangered Species Act itself. So the Lacey Act of 1900, so that's right after that 1899 law we just talked about. It regulated commercial animal markets. So these are where animals were taken either to be slaughtered or the meat from them were to be sold. Right? So it said anything that's illegally killed can't cross state lines. All right. It also says that, hey, you're not allowed to kill these specific animals, and it gave a list of some. This was not a very exhaustive list. It was very, very small. There were very few. Less than 20 animals were on this list. Over the years, there were some species-specific laws passed. So one of them was the Migratory Bird Conservation Act. Migratory birds are those that fly north or south, depending on the season. So flying south for the winter, north in the summer. And because they cross state lines, the federal government was getting involved in saying, hey, don't kill these birds while they're in your area, because it's going to affect the ecosystems across a large portion of the U.S. And then the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act of 1940 set aside specific rules for bald eagles and golden eagles because, again, their numbers had dwindled so far and we wanted to protect them. So there were two larger, broader acts, capital A Act, right? You can see it on the screen. I don't know why I need to say that led to the Endangered Species Act of 1973 directly. So the Endangered Species Preservation Act and the Conservation Act. So the Preservation Act, the first one here, gave authority to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and some money to actually protect them. So it gave them money to do some research on these specific animals, their habitats, and gave them the ability to levy fines and jail certain people that were poaching. The Department of the Interior actually started making the endangered species list. So this one, again, it started very few, less than 20, I think, on this one as well. It only listed vertebrates, so things with a backbone, right? So no insects, no plants at all. The Endangered Species Conservation Act of 1969 greatly, I don't want to say expanded here, but I'm having a hard time thinking of a different word than expanded, the definition of endangered species as a term, and it also increased the amount of protections on those animals. Again, we're still only talking about animals in the Endangered Species Act, but it is being broadened to include things like fish and birds and vertebrates, as well as insects and something else that I can't think of at the moment. I'll put a note at the bottom of the video. All right, so this also set some punishments in code that said, hey, you can't punish them more than this. So up to $10,000 fine per incident of poaching. So if you kill two animals illegally, that would be up to $20,000, up to $10,000 each, and 1 year in jail. And I know I said and in the text here, but it's and, not or. So it's not just one or the other. It could be both. It could be some amount of fine and some amount of jail time. These were just the max. Right. So the Endangered Species Act of 1973 did a lot, and if you want to, you can Google the specifics. I'm just going to hit the highlights here, much like I did for the other ones. So it said that the federal government must determine if a species is endangered or threatened. So it says if a species is endangered or threatened, and these were specific definitions that we'll go over in some activities, so I don't need to hit them here. It said critical habitat must be designated for these listed species. So if a species, if an animal is on the endangered or threatened lists, critical habitat, that means habitat that is specific to that creature and is necessary for its survival, is protected on the federal level. This was just from federal level things. It did not protect from state or private development on that land. It also said it was illegal to kill, harm, or harass these animals. So, can't kill them, Harm and harass means you can't injure them and you can't like get in their way. You can't hamper their progress. You can't, throw vegetables at them, not stuff that wouldn't hurt them but would make them angry, that kind of thing. And then it said you can't import them, so you can't bring these types of animals into the states for commercial reasons. You can't export them, so you can't sell them out of the states. And you can't sell them inside the states. Right? It also said that endangered fish and wildlife cannot be taken without a permit. So these permits are for research purposes. So if a university or a company or a branch of the government, maybe at the state level, wanted to use a few of these animals for research purposes, they would have to apply for a permit and get approved. So again, not completely illegal, just anybody without a permit can't do that. All right, so we looked at the Clean Air Act, what it does, and some of the background for it, as well as the Clean Water Act and the similar but a little different Endangered Species Act. You're going to go over a little bit more info about each of these in some activities this week and the beginning of next week, I believe, since it's going to be a little bit different week since we're starting this stuff on Tuesday, I believe. If you have any questions, as always, shoot me an email, reach out. I am here to help you. Have a good afternoon, evening, night, whenever you're watching this video.